everyone, welcome to our video, and the topic for today is building an affirmative case. In building an affirmative case, it is very important that we must distinguish what is the two types of debate proposition. So the first type of debate proposition is the value proposition. So the value proposition is a proposition that is more focused on ethics or in aesthetics. It is more on the value looks at your beliefs. So for example, resolve that cell phones is a waste of time. So this type of proposition is trying to judge the ability of something or making an ethical claim. The second proposition or debate proposition is the policy proposition. It is a proposition that is calling for change or pushing against strongly to the status quo. So for example, the cafeteria must adopt a vegetarian diet. So let us note that in the case of proposition for policy, the affirmative support for the change, while the negative support for the status quo. So what are the objectives of the affirmative case? First objective is to establish a prima facie case, in which all elements should be present at first look. And then the second objective is to provide a good reason to justify the judges or provide a sufficient ground to accept the resolution. So for example, in the proposition, resolve that American judicial system overemphasize the freedom of press. So the affirmative does not have to prove its position absolutely, rather giving those who render the decision a good reason to accept the resolution.
In order for the affirmative to be convincing, they have to answer questions pertaining to harm, inherency, and solvency. We'll discuss the requirement to prove the harm. So the harm is the absence of the greater good. For the affirmative to be persuasive, the harm should be identified as significant, compelling, and widespread. Compelling is something that is true and something must to be done, and it should concern all. There are two types of significance of harm: qualitative significance and quantitative significance. Example, malnourishment is alarming not just because of number of children affected, but because we place great value on the human life, and malnourishment is a kind of suffering to children in which we should be avoided. Next is the widespread. In order to prove the widespread, the advocate needs to present statistical evidence extent of widespread, but that is not the case always, because the case of unfair trial, even though unfair trial happened once out of thousands trials that had happened, so we can clearly understood that it is something that needs to be addressed. Next is inherency. In order to establish inherency, the problem must be identified and should be permanent fixture in the status quo that needs major reform on the level of resolutional change. So we'll discuss the two kinds of inherency, the structural inherency and the attitudinal inherency. So the strongest form of inherency is structural inherency. So the affirmative must prove that these laws, these court decisions, and societal decisions prevents the solution of its harm. So next is attitudinal inherency. So if the harm is not being solved because of the attitudes of the people, then it is a attitudinal inherency. Next, we will discuss the requirement to prove the solvency. The first requirement is the workability. So affirmative is allowed to employ fiat. This is for the sake of their argument that if their plan is shown to be desirable or feasible, then it would be adopted. The plan, aside from demonstrating workability, it should be indicate the measure of efficacy of the plan that are expected to eliminate.
Hello everybody, so I will be continuing the discussion. Let us now proceed to letter D, which is a requirement to prove the advantages. So first of all, let us first define the word advantage in the context of a debate. Advantage are the benefits or gains that the affirmative team claims will result from adopting its plan. These advantages must be shown to outweigh the disadvantages. These advantages have its attributes. First, it should contain a substantial measure of importance. It should be integrated with the needs of the proposition. For example, another is that it must outweigh the disadvantages in a proposition. So for example, it must provide a risk analysis on the proposition to weaken the argument of the negative side. Another example. Next is the application of the turnaround argument, either with link turns or impact turns. In a debate usage, turnaround argument is the affirmatives turning around a negative's disadvantage and converting it into an advantage or vice versa. So let us first talk about the link turns. Link turns is citing links on the disadvantage claim of the negative side. So we have here an example. We just created a link between business and COVID-19, which argues that opening up of businesses does not create economic growth, but rather impedes it. Now, what about the impact terms? So impact terms is stealing the impact of the opponent's claim and proving that it is in fact good and not bad, or vice versa. We have here another example. If you are on the affirmative side, then there's one thing that you should always remember, and that is avoiding making both turn arguments at the same time. or you'll fall into the trap of a double turn. Double turn is making two arguments that turn each other and serve to help the opposition. So for example, moving forward to letter E, requirement to defend topicality. Topicality or T is a procedural argument that negative teams use to defeat cases that are outside the parameters set by the resolution. The topic exists to provide notice to both teams as to what is to be debated. Going on to my last topic, which is letter F, preparation. Once the manuscript of the affirmative is completed, the advocates have to prepare brief, short speech segments that they will use to refute negative attacks and to extend affirmative arguments. In a simple explanation, in this portion, the debaters will have to prepare what they term as backup briefs, consisting of new supporting evidences and backups to further carry out and strengthen their arguments.
For the affirmative side, to promote their argument, the affirmative must go on the offensive in order for them to launch a powerful attack. So much of everything we've discussed in this topic has to do with the affirmative's offensive posture. So the affirmative must construct its case and utilize its evidence in order to attain the best balance of offensive and defensive capabilities. So the advocates must anticipate potential areas of negative assault when developing their argument. Many affirmative action proponents, anticipating Clinton's proposal, advocated for the universal coverage. But when they researched the potential negative arguments, they realized the immense expense and the complexity of universal coverage. So after considering the difficulties, many people rejected the universal coverage in favor of incremental plans, which were much easier to defend.
So while my co-reporter already discussed about what is building for optimum capability and has already give insight about incremental and universal plan, I am going to discuss further about what is the task of affirmative advocates. Now, when the affirmative advocates initiate a plan to avoid the negative attacks, the advocate must produce a significant advantages, like for instance, balancing the attack or feedback either offensive or defensive. So what is the meaning of this? The meaning is that the task of affirmative advocates is to build a plan that is to achieve the optimum balance of offensive and defensive capabilities. Now, what is the lesson learned in this topic? The fearful of debate is that a good case defends itself, and the well-planned case is to build or provide for the best effective self-defense. Thank you.
So for the alternative and debate approaches, traditions are slowly evolving. In the previous chapters, you have observed that debate is using its traditional framework. But in this chapter, we will highlight the traditional framework of debate that has been slowly evolving. So all the creative traditional practices like self-examination and change has been slowly evolving. Let us now discover the beauty of participating in debates. So debate gives rhetorical space to marginalized voices, open to more viewpoints, standpoints, and of course, cultures. So you may be asking, what are the alternative debate approaches? So the alternative debate approaches are the following. First is music, visual communication, role-playing, and other forms of self-expression. Other conventional approaches are storytelling, hip-hop, film, poetry, and novels. In disregarding the traditional frameworks of debate, these are the alternative practices. Critical approaches mainly focus on philosophical and value-based interpretations and performance-based approaches, just like music. The next chapter that you will see in this kind of alternative approach will be seen in the next page.
The presentation of argument in alternative debates can be encompassed the performance of rap, music, poetry, metaphors, and other art forms during a round. Elizabeth Jones of Louisville University presented the following rap as a part of her affirmative case in favor of US withdrawal from NATO. So you heard it right, no? So this is a rap, but I don't know how to rap, so I will read it na lang. Roma people feel just like me, tired of being deprived of their liberty, relegated to ghettos held as slaves, poor health care leading to early graves, prison scar from prison's bar, walking round the prison's yard, no running water, no heat, no jobs, and everything you've seen to love, you've lost. Will the rich get richer? Who's paying the cost? George Soros, Bill Clinton, the Dick Cheney, the so-called bearers of democracy. NATO represent the military wing of the all-powerful capitalized regime. When you think the gangsters listen to rap and sag, they really wear suits and carry leather bags. Politicians with the power to pick, define, and choose who will win and who will lose. Not hearing the Roma or Palestine, I guess it depends how genocide is defined. This form of presentation is representative of cultural art form. It is not limited to just art for sake. The use of musical and narrative forms of performance debate exemplifies the type of meta-information.